Greetings, everyone. Dr. Brian Scott with you as we begin a brand new week of the Insights to the End Times. We're looking at biblical scriptures that tell us where we are in God's timetable as we come towards the end of the age. We're also looking at things that are occurring in the world that confirm what these prophetic scriptures have said. And as I said, we are about to look at the nation of Israel being founded. Israel's in the news right now. Why? Because they're in the middle of a war. And totally unexpected, and it's had devastating impact and effect. And I want to look at some things that have given rise to this, because this is not something that just occurs off the spur of the moment. This is something that has been in the works for some time in terms of the conflict. Now, Jesus was ministering in what we call the lands of Israel back at the turn of the we went from BC to AD time-wise, and he ministered for 3.5 years, concluding his ministry in 30 AD. And during that time frame, the 12 tribes had settled the lands that we now call Israel, and so on. But by 70 AD, the Roman Empire and their armies had come. They had been operating in that region for some time. You'll remember at the crucifixion, it was Roman emperor and so on, the Herod and Pontius Pilate and so on. And the Romans dispersed all of the Jewish people by 70 AD is what I'm getting at. Jerusalem was destroyed. The people were scattered. It's known as a diaspora. There have been many diasporas in the past of great magnitude. This was not necessarily a new thing, but the Jewish people were scattered. The lands then became known as Palestine, and I have to fast forward very quickly, just for sake of time, in this quick historical overview to the 20th century. It was at that time that the British Empire, the British nation, Great Britain got involved in providing some form of leadership to this region. And in the First World War, 1917, Balfour Declaration was proclaimed, and they were essentially proclaiming that Israel should be granted lands in the region of Palestine for their own nation to be established. That did not occur until 1948, May the 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion in Israel, he proclaimed the establishment of the state of Israel. The United States recognized Israel as a state on that same date. So for the first time in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Israel once again had its own lands, its own state, its own nation. It didn't go over well with the Palestinians, with the Arabs. And as a result, Israel entered into its first major war following its establishment as a nation. It's called the War of Independence, and it began in 1948, continued into 1949. Not only were the Palestinians in that region involved, but there were other nations involved, including Egypt, Transjordan, which now is called Jordan, the nation of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. They all came against Israel in this first war in 1948 through 1949. Israel, of course, ended up being successful. Things quieted down until 1956. And that's the second war that broke out. It's called the Suez War, where Egypt essentially nationalized the Suez Canal, much to the detriment of all the other neighboring countries. And we had the Israeli armed forces come up against the Egyptians, and they took control of the Gaza Strip in the Sinai Peninsula. They had to push back the Syrians from the Golan Heights, and they had to push back the Jordanians from the West Bank. So when Israel gets into these warlike settings, it's not usually just one nation they're dealing with, it's a host of nations that surround the country. In 1967, the Six-Day War broke out in June. It lasted 6 days, from the 5th to the 10th. Israel had to deal once again repelling Syrian forces, Egyptian forces, and so on. And this is the war. I misspoke a moment ago. This is the war where they pushed back the Syrians from the Golan Heights and they pushed back the Jordanians from the West Bank. We had about a 6-year period. Things were calm to a certain extent. We've already had 3 wars by this time: the 48 Independence War, the 56 Suez Canal conflict, the 67 Six-Day War, and we get to 1973 on the Yom Kippur War, occurring in October of 73, where Egypt and Syria once again came against Israel. This war lasted a 20-day period, and by the late part of October, ceasefire agreements were finally reached. But this means death and destruction for people all along. A number of years later, but 9 years later, we have the next war. That's the Lebanese war in June of '82. The Israelis invaded Lebanon to push back the Lebanese forces. They pushed them back all the way to Beirut, and finally negotiations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, came to a conclusion, and that calmed down. But it only stayed calm until the next war in 2006, the Second Lebanese War. Now, if you're a student of these wars, you'll know that I am really highlighting just the very, very major highlights. I'm just trying to convey to you the fact that Israel has been at war to defend itself, defend the Jewish people, just about every time they turn around. And in this 2006 Second Lebanese War, the Lebanese were fighting the Israelis to get prisoners released. Unfortunately, it left 1,000 Lebanese dead and about 1 million people displaced. And so there's skirmishes, there's threats, there's all kinds of noise going on around Israel all the time. And here, just a few days ago, today is the 23rd day of October, and on the 7th, roughly 2 weeks ago, the Hamas terrorist organization within Gaza Strip, which is such a small, tiny strip of land, it's just so very tiny. They invaded the southwestern part of Israel. They slaughtered Jewish people in a concert. They slaughtered people in their homes. They took captives. 1,200 Jewish people considered to be dead at the early stages of that conflict. It continues to this day, and there's rockets still being fired from both directions, Israel into Gaza, Gaza into Israel. No end in sight. Humanitarian issues going on here. Gaza has been isolated, doesn't have fuel, doesn't have water, doesn't have food, or very, very little. Medical supplies are almost non-existent. People are being injured. It's a horrendous situation, but it's involving other nations now. And this is the 7th major conflict. The other nations, the northern border, Lebanon, they're threatening to invade. That's the Hezbollah. We have the West Bank under some form of attack. Yesterday there were, or the day before, there were attacks going on there. The point we're getting at in this quick historical review is simply to point out, in a 75-year history, this nation of Israel has faced 7 major wars because the devil and demonic forces hate God, and they hate the Jewish people who are God's people. And they're going to do everything they can to destroy them, because that is Satan's overall plan. Remember the 5 I wills of Satan? He wants to be like God. He wants to rule like God. He wants to be in charge like God. So he has to wipe out God, and he has to wipe out God's people. And that's part and parcel what the Antichrist is coming to do, is to enforce Satan's desire to be God. And we're on the verge of that occurring. We see it just about everywhere we look. We see it in the newspaper reports, on the news, on the internet. It's everywhere. These are the last days. Will you be ready? Amen. See you next week.